Thanks, Kara. Thanks, Cynthia. Thank you to you. What a great tribute to Christ in that song. Would add or speak alongside with what Mark said earlier, that our class today was a blessing and has been. And speaking personally, the blessing to me is that I get to listen and have a message spoken to me through what people share that I don't always get when I'm up here. So I greatly appreciate that, and it's a great journey to share together. If that works for you to attend at 9, even on certain Sundays, not every Sunday. Also today, following service, along with the regular fellowship time, which is straight through the doors here to the left as you exit the sanctuary, there is a lunch for those who are newer to First Baptist. And if you didn't necessarily indicate you were coming but still are here and able to come, I'd encourage you to do that. Janet will be back there, and she will sort of direct you to the place where we will meet. And we look forward to that time as well. If you have a Bible, we're in Exodus 32 for the second week, and we'll be in Exodus 32 the remainder of this month. We're in Exodus 32, and today starting in verse 7. Reading verses 7 through 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They've been quick to turn away from what I commanded them and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They've bowed down to it and sacrificed to it and have said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt.' I've seen these people," the Lord said to Moses, "and they're a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone, so that my anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation." But Moses sought the favor of the Lord his God. "O Lord," he said, "why should your anger burn against your people, whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self, 'I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give your descendants all this land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever.' Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened." We're in the second week of looking at commitment and what that means in our lives and in the church, and what it means to us in terms of God's commitment to us in life. And if you look at or talk to any minister, he or she would tell you that they're looking for their congregation to be committed to God and committed to the ministry that the church has. And they would say that often the commitment is a time that the sermon addresses in terms of people's commitment to God. And so pastors, when they get together, ministers talk about this. And there was a priest and a Pentecostal preacher and a rabbi that met for coffee one Monday morning after church, and they were all talking quite confidently about how their preaching really brought about people's commitment. In fact, they said, it's going so well that we should take on a bigger challenge. And so they said, just for a challenge this week, on tomorrow, let's all go out into the woods and we'll each find a bear, being hunting season, and we'll preach to that bear, and we'll see if we convert that bear. And we'll get back together on Friday to discuss what happened. And so they all went out into the woods. And when they got together that Friday, Father Flannery said, "Well, I read to my bear from the catechism, and then I sprinkled him with holy water, and he became as gentle as a lamb. The bishop's coming out next week to give him communion and confirmation. Then Reverend Billy Bob, the Pentecostal, spoke next. He said, well, I read to my bear from God's holy word, and I took a hold of him, and I wrestled him down to the ground and dragged him to the creek, and I dunked him, and I baptized him, and he came up out of that water gentle as a lamb. And we spent the rest of the day praising Jesus. And then they both looked at the rabbi who had showed up, and he was in a full body cast. And the rabbi said, looking back on it, circumcision may not have been the best way to start ministering to that bear. It's good to be Baptist some days, We find the people of Israel out in the shadow of the mountain, and God is so committed to them that he has taken Moses, brought Moses up on the mountainside, and spent 40 days giving him instructions for the people. That's how committed God is. He wants them to have the best possible plan for their lives. When's the last time somebody took 40 days giving instructions for your benefit? What an amazing thing God did. But meanwhile, the people are showing their commitment by, as God said, giving worship before a golden calf, and they're throwing a huge party, and it greatly angers God, and he has in mind to destroy the people. And the people probably think later on, looking back on it, worshiping an idol and throwing a big party that was a godless party may not have been the best way to start. Before Moses even got down the mountain. Not the best way to show God their commitment. I think sometimes, why is it when we look back that it's really easy to see where we've been foolish? Why it's so easy in hindsight, yet at the time things seem like such a good idea. For all the great inventions of the 20th century, this past century, some of them just made no sense. Some of the ideas, like whoever thought a mullet was a good idea? Mine was permed, by the way, back in the day. Permed mullet and huge glasses. I was the rage of the late 80s and early 90s. Some other inventions, if you go back all the way to 1950, there was an invention called Venetian blind sunglasses. Some of you might not know what Venetian blinds are, but they're blinds that you see on a lot of windows where you turn the thing and the little slats open so you can see out, or they'll close so that it blocks light out. There were actually glasses produced that had these little blinds on them, and so you could choose to have the blinds open or shut. I guess just what we need. Blind glasses, walking around and wandering, glasses that render us sightless. And to go along with that, in 1953, there was a gun that came out called the curved barrel machine gun. And the idea was that with a curved barrel that bent one way, you could fire around a corner. Never mind that you couldn't see around the corner what you're shooting at, but you could fire around the corner. I thought maybe put those glasses together with that gun and see what happens. I don't know. Perfect match. Sometimes, if we're fortunate, if we're blessed to have these people around us, a spouse or a good friend, we'll have the wisdom to stop us before we do something foolish and say, that's not such a good idea. You really shouldn't wear that shirt with those pants. It just doesn't go. Or something more serious. And sometimes we're saved countless amounts of grief because of having somebody like that in our lives. But other times, when they're not around, or when someone does not intervene, when they're up on the mountain tending to business, and we're left to our own devices, we make some pretty foolish moves. And that is when we are really glad we have someone to come back and intervene for us, to help clean up the messes we make in life. The Israelites should be really, really glad they have Moses. God says, Moses, you'd better hurry, scurry down the mountain because it hasn't taken long. And your people, whom you brought out of Egypt, they've become corrupt. It was just such a short time before in Exodus 20 where God said, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. But they did. It didn't take them long, and they lost sight of God, and they started creating things to go along with or even replace God. And now God's ready to consume them in anger, but for Moses. Moses' leadership is never put to the test more than in this moment before God, in this conversation. I imagine God speaking to you passionately and saying, I've had it with that situation at your work and all the things people are doing there, or in your family, the way people are acting in your family relationships. With all those stiff-necked people, God says an ox in a yoke is easier to manage than these people are. And I've had it with them. I'm going to get rid of them and start over with you. Imagine God saying that to you. Whatever I was going to do through them and for them, instead, I'm going to do it through you only. We'll just start all over. This is God talking now, not some other person. This is God speaking. And God's just a little bit more than peeved when He's saying this. As I read that, I thought, man, if I were hearing God say this, what would that sound like? In fact, He's being really forceful. What would you say in that? How would you respond? Oh, okay, God, that sounds great. Whatever you say. I mean, are we really going to resist God, to go against what God is saying? Well, that is exactly what Moses does. He says, "O Lord, why should your anger burn against your people? They're not my people, God. They're your people whom you brought out of Egypt. With your great and mighty hand you brought them out. It would make you look really bad, God, to the Egyptians. Like you were just setting Israel up, freeing them from Egypt, and then just bringing them out here to destroy them like some kind of cruel joke." And Moses goes on. And remember again, it's God he's speaking to, but Moses is very bold. He says, God, turn from your fierce anger. Don't hold on to this anger against your people. Relent. Don't bring disaster on them. And Moses really shows his wisdom, which shows God why God chose Moses to begin with. Moses does what we do when we want to diffuse anger in a relationship, where we see things aren't very good and we need a way to get it back to where it needs to be. When we are in those times, we point back to the root of our relationship. If you have a fierce argument with a friend, what brings you back? It's the recognition of the commitment you have to each other and the history you share and the commonality and the bond that you've developed over time. That's what Moses points to God. The great promise and hope that was built upon with God. And then he plays the Abraham card. And he says, God, remember where all of this began. Just like we would say, remember when our friendship began and where and how we met and how we built that relationship. He says, God, your promise to Abraham and Isaac and Israel started all of this. You began this long ago. When you said you'd make their descendants as numerous as the skies, remember, God, when Abraham looked up and you told him to count the stars. And even if he could, he would not be counting all the descendants that you would bring through him. And Moses says, remember, God, the place which you promised your people as a forever inheritance. And he says, God, these are your people. Moses had a choice to make. He did not choose self. He did not choose personal gain. He did not choose what was acceptable. He chose what was best. When no one else was there to defend the people, when they stood within a hair's breadth of destruction, there stood Moses for them before God. Believers, this morning, I truly believe we are called to some various and specific places in life in this world. I truly believe that. Maybe it's to one individual in a given time that you are called into that person's life. Maybe it's to people who by choice even or by circumstance find themselves in truly precarious positions of which they may not even be aware. Places where we're in a position to stand for someone, to stand in the gap for them, to stand before God on their behalf, to stand between even destruction of their life and soul. In fact, I'm so convinced to think that there may be a time when we may be the only ones on earth that are standing for someone. That without us standing before God on their behalf, they may have no one. They may have no one. Sometimes we find ourselves in a time and in a place where, if we're honest, it would be so much easier not to stand for someone. And maybe it would even be acceptable not to stand for them. And we would have more personal gain like Moses would have if we did not. But we too have to choose between what is acceptable and what is best. We are called to that choice as well. We have to choose between self and between sacrifice. 2,000 years ago, Jesus chose. He chose to take on the nature of a servant and walk among us. And boy, did he do more than walk among us. He stood for us. He stood for little children who were told not to bother him, who were getting ignored or put off. He said, "Let them come to me." He stood on their behalf. He stood for a woman who was facing scorn and ridicule and potential death because of an act of adultery. He stood on her behalf. He stood for a man who knew the law inside out, yet really did not know the truth that was within the law. And today, Jesus continues to stand for us, to stand for you. Hebrews 7:25 says Jesus is able to save completely those who come to God through him because he always lives to intercede for them. He's standing right now on your behalf. Romans 8:34 says Jesus is at the right hand of God, indeed interceding for us. Have you chosen anger over peace? Jesus stands for you. Pride over humility? Jesus stands for you. Flesh over spirit? Jesus stands for you. Lies over truth? Jesus still stands for you. Sloth over service? Wealth over wisdom? Jesus still stands for you before God. Even if you've chosen an image of God, something that you create in your mind or in your life that's sort of like God but not really God, that you've shaped with your own hands, if you stand for that over God, Jesus still stands in the gap pleading for you. And he does infinitely more than that. He goes to the cross for you. He suffers and he dies for you. When Jesus is the only one who can stand on your behalf, when no one else can or will, when he's the only one standing between you and the destruction of your life and soul, when it would be so much easier for him not to, when he could have so much more personal gain if he didn't, when it would be perfectly acceptable for Jesus to throw us away and start over, Jesus does what is best for us even then. He pays it all. Listen to Jesus this morning. He knows how small our strength is, so he says, find in me your all in all. Knows that we have nothing good by which to claim his grace and his offer of life, so he offers his life for us. His very blood in our place stands between you and God, connects you to God by his death and resurrection, and remembers and reminds and restores us this morning to the promise that we have and the place that we have as our forever inheritance. Would you listen to him this morning? I believe that sometimes as we listen, God sets apart a time and a place. I believe he may be doing that this morning. And I believe he may be saying to some of us, putting someone on our hearts and our minds that we need to stand up for, that we need to represent before him, because maybe no one else is. And I believe he also may be calling us in our own lives to say, I'm standing for you. Whatever he has on your heart, this time is open for you. As you hear the words or between now and the end of the service, this is a place to come and pray. This is a place where it's safe to come and stand before God. And if he directs you in that way, please come, sit in the front row, kneel before him, and make your prayers known to God.
I hear the Savior say, thy strength indeed is small. Child of weakness, watch and pray. Find in me thine all in all. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. Lord, now indeed I find thy power and thine alone can change the leper's spots and melt the heart of stone. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. For nothing good have I, whereby thy grace to claim. I'll wash my garments white in the blood of Calvary's Lamb. Jesus Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. And when before the throne I stand in him complete, Jesus died my soul to save. My lips shall still repeat, Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he